Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, fantastic. This is Battlefield 1. In today's video, we're going to be doing a guide for the map Amiens, and in doing so, we're going to be looking at the layout of the map as well as the individual objectives on it, looking at things like pathing and movement, individual tips for infantry combat on the map as well as vehicular combat, the role of the Behemoth, the tactics behind it, as well as the general winning strategy and balance of the map to give you guys the edge when playing on Amiens. With that being said, let's get straight into the first element because there's plenty to talk about here, and that centers around the general layout of Amiens as map. Now, Amiens is a semi-linear map, much like Empire's Edge, but more towards the linear side of things than the non-linear side of things. You've got two dummy flags, you've got two forward objectives, and then you've got two central objectives. When it comes to those two dummy flags, they're essentially there to provide you with a forward spawn for your vehicle, as well as an additional vehicle. As such, then each team gets two tanks once they've taken their dummy flag. They can be quite difficult to hold if you're trying to attack the enemy's dummy flag, and quite easy to hold if you're defending your own because of the close proximity of these objectives to the respective team's base. The forward objectives, the two, that is E and B, are a little bit easier to hold, a little bit easier to capture as well. They are both extremely close quarter focused with relatively small capture radiuses, and they're both overlooked by positions of height, that is to say buildings where you can get into them and get up to the first floor. Both cases, you can't actually capture the objectives from those positions of height, but you can quite easily take people out trying to capture the objective down below. Just to note here, you're going to want to pay attention to those spots even if there doesn't seem to be anybody on the objective. If there should be, if you saw somebody disappear onto the objective, that's likely where they're going to be located, and you're going to want to take those guys out before you proceed on to trying to actually capture the objective. Further to note about these objectives is that they are the spawning points for the elite classes on this map. Objective E provides the MG08-15 heavy machine gun, and Objective B provides the Flame Trooper Elite, both useful classes, especially the Flame Trooper when used in the correct areas of the map, specifically in this case, for example, the corridors around D and C. When we move on then to the two central objectives, Objective D and C, these are what I like to call the camping clusterfuck area of the map. They're very, very defensible because not only are the objectives quite open with little cover on the physical objectives other than under the bridge, but the huge amount of space and room in the houses facing each other off across the railway means that there's a lot of room for the team that establishes dominance in this area and makes it incredibly difficult, once properly captured, properly defended, to actually take back from the team holding it. We move on, however, from the general layout of the map to the pathing and movement concerning this map. Now, first of all, because this is a city landscape, a street map, pathing is quite limited in where you can go. Unlike the more natural free roam maps almost that you have in Battlefield 1 en masse, in this case, you have quite limited pathing of where you can go through, but also where you should be expecting enemies. Because of this, of course, you're going to want to be even more wary of where you go and if you're really in line of sight of a bunch of people. There's quite a few shooting galleries surrounding this map, especially around D and C with those first floor defensive positions. You're going to want to try and avoid those, travel through houses or smaller alleyways or flanking routes to get to where you want to go. Be aware of the line of sight of enemy. On Amiens, this is more important than on other maps because usually quite a large proportion of the enemy team and your team will be around the DC point, which means you can quickly get taken out if you take a wrong turn. When it comes to pathing, of course, we also have to look at the flanking routes, and really, Amiens doesn't have too many of them. Flanking routes really only are there in the center, and there's really only two of them. Yes, you can move around freely when it comes to pretty much all objectives other than the two central ones, but that doesn't really consist of flanking because most of the combat, the front line really, is usually around DC, and if you're going to flank something, you have to actually flank somebody. And as such, the two flanking routes really are around D and around C. They're drawn on your map now for a little bit of clarification. What you will want to pay attention to when it comes to these flanking routes, however, is that they're quite easily defended because there is only two of them, and you should really be aware of the possibility of people using them. There's not many flanking routes here to take into account. In my experience, the D flanking route is actually the worst of the two. Firstly, because both teams tend to go more for D than C, because both teams are trying to get essentially to their forward flags, which are closer to D than they are to C. Furthermore, there's a quite good position at the entrance if you were to come from E or F to that flanking route, where you have good view over most of the objective D, as well as over to a little bit of objective C, and of course the entirety of the railway tracks, as well as the opposite bank, where often the enemy team is going to have heavy presence. Therefore, there's often already players there making use of that position of height to take out enemies. While there is a similar position around the C flanking route, it isn't quite as good because it only really overlooks objective C. It isn't as frequented as much, and as such, if you're looking for a flanking route, you may want to take that one over the other. Another thing I'd like to note here is that far too little people actually make use of the provided armored cars for these flanking routes. If you spawn in your deployment, usually you should see a vehicle spawn there for you. It's obviously not a tank, but nevertheless an armored car, which is usually quite quick and will get you to your destination not only much faster, but usually a lot safer. And if you're lucky, you can pick up a couple of road kills on the way. Just one word of caution, however, the railway tracks usually are covered in mines, and as such are quite deadly to anybody traveling over them with a vehicle. We move on then to the infantry combat. Now, much like Empire's Edge, there's a certain playstyle, a certain class that is best facilitated on Amiens than others. Nevertheless, all classes can be played effectively. In the case of Amiens, unlike Empire's Edge, however, it is not the scout class. Instead, it is obviously the assault class. The huge amount of close quarters, as well as the predictable nature of where combat will take place, which favors specifically shotguns, makes this a dream for any assault player, especially those who love their shotguns. There's plentiful close quarters here. Nevertheless, there is plentiful room for the medic and support. More the medic than support, because revives are more needed on this map than ammunition, in my opinion, because it seems to be that the time to live on this map for individual players is less long. There's less people getting really good scores when it comes to KDs, staying alive for long periods of times, I have found at least, than compared to other maps or other game modes, given of course that we are talking about Conquest here. Nevertheless, both of the classes, including the support, can be played effectively. The scout is a little bit more of a tough one. It can be used effectively, especially in that central area where you can have a little bit more longer corridors, a longer line of sight from those buildings around D and C. However, it isn't your best choice if you're trying to be effective for your team. You may be able to push your KD, but if you're trying to help your team out, you really need to be getting up onto those objectives, and for that you need a weapon that is medium or close quarter capable, of which the support, medic, and assault class all have theirs. The scout class, on the other hand, doesn't really. Further to note about infantry combat here is that it is generally one of the worst maps when it comes to camping, in my experience. There's plentiful people lingering around with bipoded LMGs, AT rocket guns, or just shotguns waiting in stairwells to kill you, so just be aware when you're trying to find and seek out an enemy, they're likely already waiting around a corner for you. The last point I'd like to note actually about infantry combat on this map is what really drives quite a bit of frustration with me when playing it, and that's the bugs that really show up. And that's just Battlefield 1 and Amiens somewhat facilitating these bugs. Not only do you have the annoying fog, but you're very often within buildings in Amiens looking out onto streets, and often there lighting problems occur and you can't really see out and see what you're really trying to shoot out. Furthermore, the bugginess was trying to vault over small destroyed objects and walls drives me absolutely insane, and it's gotten me killed more times than I can really admit or count. And as such, just be aware, Amiens is, from a technical standpoint, one of the more frustrating maps to play. We move on then from infantry to vehicle. Vehicle is just as important on Amiens than it is on most other maps, despite there only being 2 per team available armored vehicles, tanks that is specifically. Now, first of all, the tanks that are best suited for this map are obviously the light tank in its flanker and support variant, not really in the howitzer variant, the heavy tank, especially the breakthrough, and even better the flamethrower version, and the assault tank. However, for the two latter to be effective, you're going to want to have a proper staffing in the tank. Otherwise, in my opinion, in my experience, the light tank really is the better choice of the two because of its turret. It can look behind it when it gets flanked. It's quicker to accelerate out of a sticky situation, at least the light tank versus the heavy tank, and overall, in my opinion, is the best general fit for Amiens. However, situationally, the heavy tank and the assault tank, when fully staffed, can make a nice push onto an objective and make a true difference in the outcome of any given firefight. When it comes to tank tactics as driver, I generally say try to stick to the forward and central flags. Don't try to go for the enemy's dummy flag that's asking to be flanked or to get dynamited from behind. That's just my personal experience. If you want to risk it, feel free to do so. Furthermore, just be aware that objectives such as E especially, but also to a certain extent B, are very, very dangerous for tanks because they have positions where infantry can get really above the tank, where the tank can't really shoot them if too close to that given position, and they can throw dynamite down, they can throw grenades down, mines down, any kind of explosives, and quickly end especially a light tank. So I would never take my tank into the objective E, and when on objective B would make sure I stay away from those two positions where infantry can get up to the first floor and have a height advantage on me. That's just my personal advice and my personal strategy when playing around those objectives. Generally, you're never going to want to rush in with a tank on Amiens unless you're using a fully staffed heavy tank or assault tank. This is because you're better off on this map because of the concentration of infantry and the concentration of assault playing a more supportive role. You'll survive longer and do more damage to the enemy team that way. In my experience, you're better off helping your team progress onto objective than suiciding onto an objective, possibly facilitating the capture of that objective, but in doing so losing the tank and having to wait for that vehicle to respawn. Armor vehicles play a huge role in deciding on who captures what objectives, on who actually wins when it comes to Amiens. We move on then to the Behemoth, the simplest section of today's video, because really you get the Behemoth, you go on to DC. As driver, that's all that you're really concerned with. You're not going to be effective if you stick back and try to simply use the mortars. You need to be capturing objectives once you have the armored train. However, there is something to note here regarding infantry strategy regarding the armored train. As soon as you see you're going to get an armored train, as soon as it comes around, as soon as it gets onto the points D and C, you're going to want to essentially lock down the flanking routes, lock down your dummy flags as well as your forward flags, and establish a clear dominance around C and D. This is what I call the classical strategy, which we will get into in just a moment. Really, you want to lock down essentially everything behind and around the central two objectives once you get that Behemoth, because not only is that much easier with the Behemoth there because it provides that supportive fire, but also it will allow you to keep the Behemoth alive for a longer period of time because you will be able to better prevent people using AT rocket guns, grenades, or even dynamite on the Behemoth. Another thing to note, of course, as Behemoth driver and gunner, beware of the endless amounts of mines that any capable team will lay down onto the tracks for you to drive over. Last but not least then, the most interesting of all of the sections, strategy and how to win. When it comes to Amiens, there really is two strategies, unlike usually just the one, to win a game. And they are conflicting, and in different situations you may even want to switch between the two. The first of the two is the classical strategy, if you so will, and it revolves around first securing your dummy and forward flag, securing the central flags, and then, as previously already stated when talking about the Behemoth, locking down that central area and the flanking routes. The problem with this is it requires a quite clearly imbalanced team in your favor to do, because locking down all of those access routes isn't too easy to do without letting anybody ever slip by and take one of your dummy flags or your forward flag. Furthermore, as soon as the enemy team then gets their Behemoth, given that you're winning with this strategy, you will have to either be extremely quick to take out that Behemoth or resort to the second strategy that we will discuss now, and that is the Insurgent Strategy. It revolves not around necessarily abandoning the central area, but certainly not putting all your eggs in that one basket. Instead, using the flanking routes, using the armored cars, getting behind the enemy team, and causing some havoc by taking their dummy flag and forward flag. This only really requires one or possibly two squads to do for a couple of minutes. The consequence of this is then that your team can move up onto D and C, take the center part of the objective, and then either choose to push further on into B and A, which usually at this point there is a small window of opportunity where the enemy team is actually quite split and not fully present on any given location, and you can suddenly steamroll them almost into their base, or you can establish very strong defenses around D and C and follow the classical strategy model. In reality, in most games, sadly, no team is ever going to be so organized, so I would give you the general recommendation. As soon as DC becomes a little bit bogged down, you notice you're not going to be capturing any objective anytime soon without losing a significant amount of tickets and time, because there's a decent amount of defending enemy players there. They're quite well established. Get in an armored car and go for the flank. You're going to be able to do a serious amount of damage to the enemy team, and it really does make the difference between losing and winning the team, especially when you can start doing cheeky things like grabbing objective B or E and grabbing their elite class. My favorite thing to do really is grab the elite class on B, head over to C, and clean up the entire enemy team lurking in those corridors, because what better way to remove a couple of campers than roasting them for dinner. The concluding remarks here really are around the balance. Amiens isn't generally a poorly balanced map, but usually leads to one team clearly winning. Be aware of that. If you're falling behind in the early game, you quickly have to remedy the situation, or because of the Battlefield 1 ticket system, you are going to lose per se. In my games, the average ticket difference between the winning and losing team, independent of which team I am on, is generally around 200 tickets. I personally don't enjoy Amiens, especially not in solo play as player, because of the many bugginess, because the huge amount of camping that goes on, but especially when playing with a squad, Amiens can be a very fun map to play, has a decent balance between armor and infantry in my opinion, and doesn't suffer from the pesky amount of bombing that goes on most of the other conquest map because of the lack of available aircraft. With that being said, if you have additional feedback you'd like to leave down below in the comments to this video, to Amiens as map, to this map guide, feel free to do so. Also head up into the info box above and let me know which map you'd like me to do a map guide on next. If you found the video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up down below. And with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.